Okay, well, I grew up in a town north of LA called Simi Valley. It's in the county of Ventura with two sisters, one younger, one older. And we're a Mexican American family. At the time in the 70s, the Simi was a very beautiful, like more rural kind of area. A lot of Westerns were filmed up in there. Little House on the Prairie was even filmed up there. There's Bob Hope owns some property called Hope Town, and Spawn Ranch, where the Manson family took up, was there. So as a kid, I was very lucky to, even though we didn't have a lot of money, but we didn't need money being in this kind of more rural area. And we had horses, we had motorcycles, and but so it was a good upbringing, and music was always around our house. My dad is a very talented guitar player. He could pick like Chet Atkins. I don't know, he wasn't very much into Mexican music, although he could play some really nice boleros, and he liked a lot of bossa nova from Brazilian music, and he taught himself like malagueña, some of these like Spanish flamenco type things. And so as a kid, I was always around it. And he was also a really brilliant cartoonist. Kids would come to our house, my friends, and spend the night, and they would go home with a caricature of themselves, you know what I mean? And it was just like, so I don't know, it was like art was always around. I think at one point my dad kind of pushed the guitar on me as a little kid, and I was not so much into it. I was more into drawing as a little kid. I was super into birds. I've always been into birds. And I used to just draw these like poster size, like my own posters of eagles and like hawks and, birds of prey mostly. I was just fascinated with the birds of prey. And I wish I still had them. I had an aunt remind me. She goes, man, I wish I could see those, but who knows what happened to them. And there was always this weird thing with my dad's story. And when I started to play music, it wasn't until my dad was gone. And I don't think it was so much filling a void. It was just that my sister joined a band, and there was all these kids, in our garage. My mom was really cool, and she would just let us, at least she knew where we were, and we had all these stoner heavy metal kids over at our house, and, probably some of them, been in juvie already, but it was a good place to come to our house, a really safe space. But it was really inspiring to me because my sister's 2 years older, and 2 years could seem like an eternity, and one of the guitar player kids that, Sterling Reese, was a virtuoso, and the other kid, Victor Indrizzo, who's a pretty famous drummer who ended up being my brother-in-law, but he was a brilliant drummer. And these kids could, at 16 can play like moving pictures, like stuff, from Rush, or play Ozzy Osbourne. Like Sterling can play every Randy Rhoads lick, and that's really what wanted me to play. And I wanted to play guitar at first, but I ended up playing bass, and it made sense because as a kid, I loved Paul McCartney. He was my favorite Beatle. Gene Simmons was my favorite guy in Kiss, you know what I mean? But I think it was just because Sterling blew my mind so much that I wanted to play guitar at first. But I ended up with a bass only because, and this bass next to me, only because my friend Dean Georgie didn't play bass, but someone owed him money, I assume for illegal stuff. But it was only $150 that the guy owed him, but the guy gave him this bass, and this bass was probably worth more. And finally, it was something I could afford. And this has been the instrument I've played all my life, and it's been super awesome. And we've been lots of places together now. But so at that point, I was still doing art. I was in AP art classes in high school, but music was just burning on me more and more. And I was playing basketball still, and that just became a drag. Just the jock world just didn't sit with me, and I didn't have a dad around pushing me. The advantage of a lot of kids in sports with the that world could be pretty brutal, with people's dads yelling at their kids. And I still remember, one time in a game, and, I thought it was pretty good, but the longer I got, I saw these kids that had advantages with, like playing private leagues, you know what I mean? And they were like, a couple of them, like this guy, Don McLean, who ended up playing for UCLA, went to the Washington Bullets even. So I was benched. These kids had played together. They knew their plays. I was an outsider. And at that moment, I just realized I'm quitting that. And I just got more into rock and roll, and just that counterculture of, punk and metal or whatever, the misfits. And it was a really good thing. And I think it was like a medicine for me, and it still is, it's just the one thing in my life I can rely on, the one thing that means the most, when it's just like, I don't know, money or whatever, I don't know, it's all comes and goes, but the one thing no one can take away from me is the ability to communicate with other human beings in this pretty intellectual way, like without words, or sometimes with words, and well, yeah, I was always being compared, or my parents, my grandparents, my parents eloped, so they didn't really approve of my dad. And when my dad was a musician, my grandpa called him La Cucaracha, like that was his way of saying that Beatle, because at the time, that's what changed my dad's life was the Beatles. Like a lot of kids, probably hundreds and thousands of garage bands were started after the Beatles played on Ed Sullivan, and even, and my dad had a band called the Beethovens, and my dad didn't really give it a real go at songwriting. In fact, he played a lot of covers. At one point, he did sell a song. He had a band called FDR or whatever, and signed a really bad deal with Portrait Records, which Heart was on Portrait, and it was a small label at the time. He had a gangster manager named Vinny Albino that like snorted all the money, ended up bailing, so his career tanked. He did make some money. The song he wrote was sold to these guys, the Keane brothers, which Bob Keane, who was Delphi Records for Richie Valens and stuff. So, and it was cool. But for me, I was being advised not to follow in my dad's footsteps, and they knew I liked art. And they said, why don't you go to art college? You know what I mean? And the more and more I went that way, and I started out at a community college taking art classes, and it didn't really it wasn't speaking with me. Music was burning on me more and more. I guess one of my first big money making things, my sister sung a song for a guy named Elliot Wolf, who Elliot Wolf was writing all these like pop songs for Paula Abdul and stuff. My sister used to sing along with these tracks before they had like technology to correct people's pitch. They would ghost track, and my sister would sing along. But one day he just asked her, "Hey, do you want to sing this song? It's kind of a throwaway song. It's going to be for this B movie called True Love." And she sang it, and it just like exploded. It ended up going to number 8. It's not her world. My sister was really into Ann Wilson and Robert Plant and Shaka Khan. Those were her idols, not to be a teeny bop dance star. But anyway, she got locked into this thing, and that was my first chance to work with her and my brother-in-law at the time, and we wrote all her songs, and we, made some money. But as far as backing up back to the teenager thing, it was just at the time, I didn't know it, it just seemed like a world like I knew nothing about, and you have a narcissistic dad who thinks he knows it all, but he didn't really know it either, and everyone thinks they know. It was like a mystery, how do you make music? How do you make a living at it? It seemed like a world that only few, get that chance, and it's sort of true back then, the record industry just bottlenecked it, you know what I mean? So, but it didn't stop me from just playing, the thirst to play and go watch musicians shows. And at a young age, I was very open-minded. I quickly abandoned heavy metal. I think early 80s, I would say I would have been like 14 was when I first started playing. It would have probably been, early 80s. But shortly after that, I discovered George Clinton, and through like the Red Hot Chili Peppers. I remember MTV used to have a show called The Cutting Edge, and I saw the Chili Peppers on there, and they showed the True Men Don't Kill Coyotes video, and I was like, Flea just was like, whoa, what the heck is going on here, and then George Clinton produced their second record, and it was just like, that changed my mind. I was like, oh, bass could be this way and heavy, you know what I mean? It was just like, and I was always just searching things out. Tom Waits got on my radar from a show there, and, it was just like, and from Tom Waits, I learned about Captain Beefheart and Thelonious Monk. I started getting into jazz, and I think I always wanted I was really attracted to black music and black musicians, and, it just was exciting me really, fast. Well, the minute I could get out of Simi Valley, because Simi Valley at this point, when Ronald Reagan became president, became a real drag. It was developing like really fast. Everywhere was a bust. There was way too many cops in the city, like for the little town it was. It was obvious that they would profile anyone that was different. If you had long hair, color, like I was both. Like, you couldn't skateboard down the sidewalk by the grocery store without getting picked on. But so by the time I was 18, me and a handful of friends all moved to Hollywood. One of my friends, Victor, started playing with a band called Red Cross, and I got a gig playing with Pat Smear, who was in the Germs, and it was like 8 years after the Germs, and he was signed to SST, the punk label. The guy from Black Flag ran it, and Pat Smear was just a really down to earth guy. He, really talented guitar player, had a pretty unique way of singing. He wanted to make music. He was really into Queen, and he made a record with a guy named Paul Rossler, a keyboard player who had been in lots of, different bands. And his sister was Kira Rossler, and it was in Black Flag. But Pat was awesome. It was funny because I went down, I found out from a friend named Chuck. And they're, these guys are all older, and I was just like hanging out with guys that were like 30 already, you know what I mean? And they said, you should come out and try out. And we went down and tried out. And Chuck had a place in this place called Vernon to practice. And down there, no houses have basements. So you had to go find somewhere to rent. And it's usually 100 degrees in these things. And, and you're practicing in them. But Pat, when I first met him, he was just so nice. And he was always wearing the same thing. He was poor, just like, I don't know. I felt like I was the only guy that tried out, and I got the gig, you know what I mean? And it lasted for about a year and a half maybe. And it was very scary. And Pat took it like a champ, like people just threw shit at us all the time because they wanted to hear the Germs. They didn't want to hear this stuff Pat was doing. And I don't know. We did some tours around the Southwest and up to San Francisco or something. It was just, LA and San Francisco liked us, but everywhere else we went, it was very dangerous. And like, I don't know, wasn't fun. So needless to say, Pat abandoned that. And then, and around that time, my sister, that thing that happened with my sister, and Pat came along with us, and he's on my sister's record. He sings on it. He even did some shows with us. We did a giant show at the Rose Bowl for Kiss FM, which is a big pop thing. We played with Wilson Phillips and just different pop artists of the day. And we went out there and we dressed like food, like Fruit of the Loom. And I don't know, it was just, and we decided to play live instead of Lipstick. So we were real, I don't know. We didn't really like compromise anything. We didn't really want to be in that position anyway. My sister didn't. And so what do we have to lose, We ended up with a $250,000 publishing deal from Warner Chappell because of the hit being on the record. And it just seemed really weird, the one time I did make so much money was not for art purposes, but just for like cookie cutter like situations. And we happened to luck out in it. And it kept us going for a while, but I've always been a bass player. I'm a late bloomer when it comes to, so after Pat Smear, that ended because it was just violent. And, the final gig with Pat was at this place called Zombie Zoo. These kids were heckling us, and Pat ended up just like taking his guitar off and was like swinging at these kids. And Jenna, his girlfriend at the time, was like scared because they first met like at a germ show, and Darby was throwing provoking everyone to do damage, whatever. And like she got cut by some glass, and it was just, so she was just not into that. And the thing imploded. Chuck got in a fight with his girlfriend that night, punched the wall, and it was just like, it's over. It's like Chuck can't even drum anymore. It's like, and Chuck was my connection to Portland. So, we had that thing going. It just fell into the thing with my sister, and I brought Pat with me, and he was a lot of fun, and then Pat and Victor got in a fight, and it just, the whole pressure of that thing got really tough for me. And I'm young, and I didn't know what, like I said earlier about the music business, it still was a mystery to me. Now I'm in it, and I'm not sure how to like navigate it, and we had these business sharks and lawyers, and you know what I mean? And I remember at one point I wanted my own cut, and I was being told that I'm being greedy, that we need to keep this as a business, even from my brother-in-law, and it felt really ugly. For that young, I was so stressed out about it. And I still love music, and so when that ended, I ended up coming to Portland. And this is where I reset, and I came up with some friends. We had another friend, Jimmy Snyder, who came out of a record deal. It was a stressed out record deal too. And we just said, let's just promise ourselves we're going to keep this thing like fun. And you know what I mean? And like, we were just priding ourselves on moving away from that, and people were wondering why we were coming to Portland, because grunge was big at the time. Why aren't you going to Seattle? That's where the scene is, and we were just like, because we want to get away from this, I don't know. It's just, at the time, I had to reset, and Portland was a great place to do that. So when I came to Portland, I was, trying to just reset, and, me and his friend Jimmy Snyder, we had a band, and my girlfriend at the time was in it, and I met this guy, Greg Odell, and we, it was just, but at the same time I was going to college, and it was good, and I didn't graduate. I pretty much did. The one thing that kept me from graduating was art class, because I got kind of cocky, because I'm getting an A in AP art, whatever, but there was this other like elective art class and I had this really strict teacher, Mr. Kana guy. So he failed me and I didn't graduate because of it. So shooting back to Portland, when I started at Clackamas Community College, and I did a year of that, and I just ended up getting my GED here and just kept going. And I ended up getting a bachelor's. I thought I was going to be a music teacher here, and just, played music for fun. Got more into jazz and classical, like learning to play the double bass. I was always interested in that. And, jazz was a mystery to me. It seemed like this thing that was a lot more complicated than I found out, that it, it was an oral tradition, it was taught that way. And, I, got a couple master class from a couple, like this guy, John Clayton, who the teacher at Clackamas, Tom Wakeling, brought there. And he kind of set me straight, and it's just like, I think jazz became something to profit on in the schools, and like that this is the only way you're going to play jazz is go through this. But you realize like back in the day, these people were just talking, and the whole bebop thing even became from how they used to describe their melodies. The melody goes be that ba-doop bop, whatever. And so, and it became apparent, and then it just was like, I don't know. And then once I figured out that, jazz was like kind of like, okay, it's a 32 bar form. It's an art form for sure, especially for saxophones and, like things that are lead instruments. But for bass, I'm just circling around this 32 bar thing, and I don't think the bass is a very good solo instrument. So I don't know. I drifted back to songwriters and stuff. And seemed simultaneously, a friend, Luther Russell, moved up here, and his band, the Freewheelers, broke up, and he kind of sucked me back into a record deal that he had with a guy named Mark Ford, and it was called Federale, and I was in college, and it was risky because I had a scholarship, and I was, out at PSU, and I was in my like junior year, and like doing pretty well, and glad I did. I got an education, and like I said earlier, I was studying to be a music teacher and just studying music. I wanted to study biology, but I had a counselor guy kind of talk me out of it. I thought, to the point, I felt that was kind of lame of the guy, but I just didn't have the confidence, but I thought maybe going into biology, especially because my interest in birds and stuff. And I don't know, he was just like, I don't know, it was kind of lame about it. So it just seemed like, oh, well, I'm going to college. This is great. I'll study music. I'll do something practical, become a teacher. But after doing a couple like student teaching gig, like volunteer things, I realized that wouldn't be for me. I would hate music if I had to do that. And sorry, but, kids, unless you want to be there, I don't see why people want to push their kids to play music, because it has to be burning in their belly to do. And like myself, it was burning in my belly to do, and it was an outlet for me, like I said, a medicine for me, And so it was just one of those things. I just ended up with a liberal arts degree, whatever, just basic. I started to develop my own voice through college and taking some Chicano Latino studies classes. And I felt like, I think this would be the beginning of like some of my lyric content as a songwriter. And it happened simultaneously with playing with Luther Russell and the band Federale, who has always been super encouraging. And, even in Federale, he got me to, when we were doing demos, he made sure I had a few demos of things I can sing. I think he wanted a band like the Beatles where there was like 3 songwriters, you know what I mean? And like, so, and he included me in singing and stuff. And it was something I was never like, I knew I could do, but I wasn't very, very, like, I just didn't have the, like, I guess the ego for it, I guess, at the time. And I just, it wasn't like that important to me. The bass was good enough for me at the time. And so after Federale broke up is when I first did my first solo record called Hawks and Highways. And Luther kind of walked me through it. He said, is there any song ideas you have? Blah, blah, blah. And, I had these little things, and he showed me how to map out a record, like by demoing it, and we mapped these things out on a 4-track. And before we know it, we found the perfect studio to do it. We did with Mike Kirkendall over in his house in Southeast Portland. And, it seemed strange. Like, whoa, we're doing this in the house, what I mean? But, Mike's done some killer records already. He did M. Ward and, the She and Him stuff in there, and on his own stuff, Fernando, all the kinds of records. And it kind of established me as now what I can call an artist, you know what I mean? Like, and learning the art of recording, and it was just, I had recorded before with people and played back, but I think this is really when it was a big turning point for me. And by this time, I'm like in my 30s, so pretty late, but it's just all a big adventure, I mean, I keep growing, as this, artist or whatever you want to call him, musician or songwriter or whatever. So, I don't know. I'm glad I did that with Luther, the Federale thing, because I was in a scholarship with, school, and it was kind of dangerous, to like, I had a year to be able to defer my scholarship. And there was all these things that hourglass is going down here. Okay, this is getting to the end of my deferment. And at one point, we got dropped, and we were just trying to hang on. And we didn't have an A&R person anymore. And luckily, the whole thing worked itself out, and I was able to go back to college and finish out my degree. But at this point, now I'm a solo artist, right after that. I had some money that we got from getting let go from the record deal. They gave us each 20 grand. And that's what I recorded Hawks and Highways with, and with Luther. And, and it was, I appreciate Luther. He's produced 3 of my records now, and it's just, I'm super happy with them, and he's just, me and him can just do these things really fast. And he's a multi-instrumentalist, and we just, but anyway, all my records now are like that, like I said, the Chicano thing, and became sort of the things I like to sing about, and at this point, after having my first solo record and I realized a lot of my subject matter was about Chicano experience, Native American experience. I started to seek out other Chicano rock artists like Los Lobos or Alejandro Escovedo and Santana, and I realized there's not that many of them, and they're all just rockers. And, being able to meet some of them too, and you realize that it was difficult, like it's much like black artists too. I don't know where it became with black artists, where there had to be a thing called the Black Rock Coalition, which I belonged to at one point in LA. I used to go to a lot of their events and meetings, and it seemed really ludicrous to me, like I loved Fishbone, and I loved, like I said, through Funkadelic and all these bands. And it was just really weird that record companies always seem to make genres out of something, or race records, or whatever. And it became really silly to me that like they just couldn't let Fishbone be, or they can't just let Los Lobos be. I even heard Los Lobos say it about like that Chicano, we're not Chicano rock, we're just rock and roll singing. We're just Chicanos singing rock, you know what I mean? And to me, that's all really, at this point, I felt like if there is a genre, I'm in this genre now. And I thank the schooling for that, it gave me something to sing about. And I didn't have this thing to sing about before. I was just playing bass and listening to other people sing. And now I feel like a songwriter, I tell people I can't stop singing about this stuff. I don't know. And it's still, and the more and more it goes, you see the importance of singing it, and it's basically just rock and roll still. But, some of us may start using like Mexican kind of rhythms. And that's the thing I love about rock and roll. It's a huge umbrella. We can bring in all kinds of influences, whether it's, even like prog rockers or something started just bringing in these like, crazy jazz or fusion-y kind of things, or different, but in a weird way it's just another rock genre. So at this point it's awesome. It was a super turning point simultaneously between Luther helping me make a record, the schooling I got. Now I'm just set up, and so the last 20 years, I'm not super prolific, but when I get something going, I'm getting more and more like prolific as I get older, which, kind of, I wish I would have gotten this desire and had something to say younger, I probably would have a bigger career, maybe, I don't know, or not, I don't know. It's tough. Alejandro Escovedo, I got to play with him. He's one of my heroes. And, him telling me how he used to get confused in, record labels where they would, just because his name, he decided to keep his name like Escovedo, his niece is Sheila E., and she went by Sheila E., and it was easier for her not to be confused with anything. But he would always talk how he ended up in the world music. And it's just like, he's just rock and roll, but he's in the world section, and that can ruin you. And I ruined myself on the Hawks and Highways thing because I included this Native American kind of thing in my bio, because I really loved the band Redbone, and they were a big influence on that record. And, so I mentioned it. It was probably not the right things to do, because I ended up being listed under New Age, especially in iTunes and stuff. And I remember not noticing it until later. I saw a little comment under something in iTunes that said, "Why is this under New Age?" It's like, this is, but I guess that's what people think of Native American, is New Age flute music or something, And so, I don't know, it's a journey. But I mean, back to my artistic thing, I'm happy now that I have this, even a bigger reason to keep doing this, like to play music, and I have something to say. And it's like, rather than just playing the bass and throwing my eggs in somebody else's basket. And then, when they decide it's not working for them, I'm just left with nothing. Now I have control even if I'm throwing my eggs in some baskets, I always have my own thing to come back to. And, and I've been lucky that way. And, right now I get to play in some cool bands still. And I have this, I'm just staying versatile and keeping this going, My advice to any young person that would want to play music, regardless of your race or anything, is first and foremost, I would say you just gotta love it. And you just gotta do just about anything. We're at an advantage now in music industry, whatever our lack of it, that we do kind of have control a little more, whether that's good or bad. It just opened the floodgates. There was something to an advantage of bottlenecking, if you were really that good. But as far as technology has come along, technology has made just about anybody be able to be a pop star. And, and as far as me as a Chicano artist, I'm glad I just have something to sing about. And my experience is, man, early on, whatever you're feeling in your heart, you should just sing it. And at this point, growing up, my parents were encouraged not to speak Spanish. And, partly through the turmoils of their ancestors or their parents. And, it's just like, there was a time when it was practically illegal, and the empowerment I had of education was realizing like the history of Southern California or Texas or the Southwest, of all these places where I'm like, man, this was Mexico. Our history stayed here. So I encourage any, especially Latino young artists or whatever, just to be proud of and don't be afraid to speak up and say these things. Unfortunately, it took me to my 30s and being educated on it. But, it's like, so if anything, to encourage young Latino youth or Native youth is figure out who you are and be empowered by it and just be able to, express this. And rock and roll is a great vehicle because it's always been a rebellious thing, and what you hope anyway. There's been some lulls, where things aren't, and just become cookie cutter. That's what you love about when some genre comes along like grunge or whatever, and, Kurt Cobain can just turn the industry upside down or something, and, sadly, I'm wondering when that's going to happen again, but that's the danger of it, which I said, when the floodgates opened, everybody's a star, you know what I mean? Or, but how do you get noticed is another thing. Is it's still a mystery that I'm trying to do. I realize video content is huge. I'm trying to do a bird show, bring my interests together to interview musicians about their experiences, and hopefully that will help young people, at the same time, making correlations with birds, that some of them may be extinct, and because of environmental things. And if you look at the music industry as an environment to musicians, whether it's new technology or whatever, and you can look at flash in the pan pop stars as an invasive species, like a starling or something that got introduced here, and it's taking out the songbirds, like the thrush or something, what I mean? And it's just so these are all in my weird world as an adult. And it's, I think a lot of people as they get older turn into bird watchers, but it's just something I've always been into, and it's fun. And I'm hopefully trying to make this into something. I've loved birds. I've always loved birds since a little kid. I mentioned earlier how I love to draw birds of prey. As a kid, a hobby I had was collecting pigeons. There was two different people that lived on my street, this couple and this other guy, Don Camp, who kept pigeons, and they were part of a racing club. And it's a real deal thing. The racing club was like, they make big money and they race these pigeons. They put little bands on their legs and they take them up like up to San Francisco and they fly to LA, and then you clock them. The minute they fly in, you clock them, So it's a real retiree thing. So, but I also loved bird watching, and I was obsessed with them. I used to catch scrub jays like in the stick and box, whatever. I caught one just to hold it and see it really close. And I don't know where it comes from. Maybe it's genetic Native American part of me, whatever too. But I just, it's been something that's been ongoing, and it's always great being on the road, and getting to see, and more as I'm getting older, my friends are being more receptive to it. But when I was younger, it was just like, I remember a time in El Paso with Luther, and he was just complaining about this noise outside and fucking birds, and I was like, it was morning time, and he didn't sleep very well anyway, or whatever. And he's bummed at these birds. But I'm like, whoa, what is that? And I opened the curtain, and it's just like, oh man, these are grackles, And I was like super stoked seeing grackles. So it's always been something just always around me, and I think I feel connected to creator. You know what I mean? Like, it's to me like a sort of a church. To me, there's nothing cooler than seeing, like, you don't see them all the time, but when you see a golden eagle or something, it's pretty magical. It's something like, and you see these things like circling and they fly, like, and they're big birds, and you can see them as little dots. I don't know how they get that high up there. I mean, it's something pretty heavenly to see. And, I've seen a golden eagle 3 times in my life, and it's always still just like godlike, and super cool. And you could see why Native Americans were so, like, in a lot of cultures, even in a lot in Asia, the Mongolians, and they used to hunt with golden eagles, and, but so, yeah, I've developed a project. I'm calling it On the List, kind of incorporating the idea of a list. I first called it Life List because bird watchers keep a thing called a life list. And, it's like, oh, I saw a sage grouse in Malheur County in this date, and they write it down. And it's like a journal, and I'm not super like good at that, I'm like keeping those things, and, and it's hard to keep at. Once you go to Malheur once, you got almost 300 species just in that one weekend. And, that's a pretty good start to a list. And you're not going to add to it very often unless you're bird watching all the time and you travel to Alaska or something and to see a ptarmigan or something, or going to Arizona to see a trogon, or, like you got to travel. And I don't have that advantage. But, so this show, now that a lot of my friends are getting receptive to it, and the whole thing came from bringing a friend bird watching out to Sauvie Island once, and we were pretty loud, and the whole time we were talking about rock and roll, and like, I was like, this is kind of funny, and it kind of made me think of Fishing with John, and which is a show John Lurie had where he took some avant-garde actors and hip actors and guys like Tom Waits or somebody fishing, and it was pretty funny. He only created 7 episodes. He broke the bank or whatever. And, that's all that came of it. And anyway, so when I've told people the other day, they compare me to that or whatever. So I'm, I started seeing this thing with the musician, the bird. And, when I was calling it Life List, it sounded kind of like bucket list, like kind of like you're dying or something. And it sounded a little more depressing. But I was thinking of other things, bird, in the title, and I was just trying to find something. And then one day, while filming one episode with a friend of mine, Willie Vlotten, and I don't know, it was just like kind of this go tell it on the mountain kind of moment after hiking like a 2,000 foot hike. And I was just kind of like, and getting up there, and we were at this thing called Hawk Watch, and these guys keep like endangered species lists. That's what they do. They track these like migratory hawks, and they write them down on these lists. And so there's the list thing again. And then I started thinking about song lists. Everybody wants to be on the guest list, and so that's like, ooh, on the list. And then a subtitle, Birdwalk Music Talk. And I just, the only thing keeping me from doing this is money, but it's there. I want to do some more. And I feel like a pretty hip idea. Recently I've seen some kids and millennials in New York City, African American kids, who were doing it. One of them works for Rolling Stone, and I was like, oh wow, thought my idea was super unique, and somebody else is doing it, and they're being a little more obvious about it. One of the guys called it birding with Charles, obviously. And I saw some tweets, and there's another African American kid that claimed this kid stole his idea, and he's got more money from Rolling Stone. But I was like, at this point, I'm kind of stoked because I can see how good of an idea it is, and whether the public is ready for it, I don't know. And so I don't know. It's just another way of me just hoping to, stay in the game and have video content, which my advice. Well, I don't have to have advice to young kids. They're the ones setting this bar high of like, you've seen these kids that go viral on YouTube, and there's ones that do it. They were the first to do it. Now everyone's trying it. Everyone wants to be a YouTuber, and it's once again, the floodgates are open and everyone's trying to, and then there's a new one, TikTok or something, and you just never know. You never know with anything, and I always keep the philosophy. I think I heard from Woody Allen that said, success is where preparation and opportunity meet. And that would be my biggest advice to young people, and just do it from the heart, And as far as, Chicano artists, don't be afraid to say these things, I mean, I have cousins some of the subject matter that I even sing about, I have a new song called, I didn't cross the border crossed me, and it's just, that could be uncomfortable, I find a lot of Mexicans sometimes want to keep their head down and not stir up, especially if you're a dreamer, a DACA. I am not. I'm a Chicano, like old school, like so that's hence the border crossed us, Sometimes I wish I had family in Mexico that I could go visit easier, you know what I mean? But our family, we're California, so it's, I feel disadvantaged there, I don't know. It's like, but I don't know. It's given me a lot to sing about now these days, and I'm happy with my education about, road stories. I mean, there's a lot of them. I've been really lucky lately with to play with a band called the Lines, which is the new project from the guys from Richmond Fontaine, who I also kind of took over as and finished that. And I mean, these guys are so easy to tour with. I've been on tours where people, can really make the thing a bummer, like pre-bandanas and, what I mean? And like, but these guys are so fun and so hilarious, all the time. We're like, Sean, the drummer, we call him HQ, and he always is able to keep light. But one of my favorite moments on the road was something about playing in London is always pretty stressful because it's so big. It's just overwhelming. It's like, even growing up in LA or being in whatever major cities in America or whatever, like London really just, it's something else, But we played this gig and it's always stressful because traffic and we're barely making it there. And it was just, the whole thing. And we had a buddy, Fernando, with us, and we played this, in a really hip area of town, Camden Town. And it was like, and this gig was like, the stage was really boomy. It was just like, I don't know if they normally have rock shows there, but I think it's a disco. And a lot of the clubs in Europe and England or whatever, Ireland, and they they have you play pretty early, and then they treat you all good, and then the minute you're done, they're just like, get out, because they want to get the discos in there, and this place is obviously one of those places, but it just sounded bad and everything, and it just didn't go well, and I felt like everyone's morale was down, and Sean, and Fernando was like, I hate, we had our buddy Fernando with us, and Fernando was just like, I hate London, I'm never playing here again, and Sean's like, everybody in the lobby. And he was just like, he was a little like buzz or whatever. And he just like comes in, he's like, Dan, you keep doing what you're doing. Freddie, learn the difference between a D major and a D minor. And, just saying these ridiculous things like he's like some coach or whatever. And it's just, I don't know, it was just so funny and brilliant. Like, I don't know, like comedy when you just need that pep talk. And I feel really lucky as a middle-aged man to have this camaraderie and be able to go see these places. They've taken me to Australia now, and it's very comforting to still be in the game a little bit. Even though it's not a full-time thing, but it's some pretty decent income extra a year, and I've been lucky through the years to play with as a bass player for a lot of different people. I can list off a couple artists like Ian Moore was when he first moved to the Northwest, and I have a great moment with him in Spokane, which was pretty funny. And this is always like one of those dangers on the road, and you never learn from it. But I don't know. I was super hungry, and I had some guy make me a sandwich, and I told him no mayo, and I got kind of sick. And I just remember I was with Sean Oldham too, and I don't know, me and him were playing pool, and all of a sudden I'm just like, and I was like, oh man, am I gonna make it through this gig? It's miraculous when the adrenaline with gigs, how you can get through these things. But anyway, Ian was worried about me, and I got through it, and I don't know, it was cool. He gave me such praise of like, man, how did you're a true it's not a lot of people can step up to things like this and do that. And it made me feel really good, I got to play with a guy named Curtis Salgado, who I don't consider myself a blues musician, but it was a lucky time to play with him. And, I have mad respect for the blues, and it was cool because, a lot of times he's going through band members like crazy, and he goes through these guys that probably look down on the blues and wanted you to do something else, but it's a good paying gig. But I came in there and I took it serious, and I gotta say, he's taken me to some crazy corners of this country, and I have a really funny gig with him going into Quincy, Illinois, which is the bottom corner of Illinois and right on the Mississippi. And it was just like this David Lynch, hotel, it was just crazy. And me and Kramer, the road manager, decided to go look at the river. It was super humid out, and we walked over there and smoked a J, and we came back, couldn't find our way back. What door did we come out of? And when we were going through the lobby or the aisle, then we come across this pool. We can smell chlorine, and I shit you not, we saw this big, large lady and this young boy making out in the jacuzzi. And I was like, oh man, this is crazy. And then later at night, we played with these guys, for these dudes, and they were cooking squab pigeon. I thought they were frogs, but they had them butterfly, and they look like little frogs on the thing. And, and it's the one thing, when Trump became, I hate to bring him up, but when he became president, people were trying to tell me, you need to, and these are richer Republican cousins of mine, that I don't know why they're so mad. And, I don't know, they live in these gated communities in Orange County and married rich, and they're just but they have the the balls, I guess I should say, to tell me that I need to go check out the flyover states, they call it. And I go, dude, I've probably been to more corners of this place, even with government mule, taking us through the South, Federale took us through the South, and, and that's one of the one good things I always feel about being a musician is just to be able to go face to face with these things, opportunities that people don't get to do, and and usually these people, I could tell they're weary of me, and then after I rock, some blues for them and eat a pigeon with them and drink a fucking Coors Light or whatever, and they trust me now. I wouldn't have went out alone in that town, you know what I mean, and to a bar or whatever. They wouldn't have seen me in context of the show or whatever, But so America, yeah, I mean, I had some great shows. Probably one of the greatest shows for me, I had a little Mexican rock band that didn't make any waves, but there was these young kids. I got in the band with them, and I wanted to play rock en español, when that whole thing became a genre. And I know I talked about Chicano rock. For a moment there was a genre called rock en español, and it was like, they tried to, it was short-lived. Bands like Ozo Motley probably capitalized the most on it. And even though they were singing in English most of the time too, it was like half and half. And but through these friends of mine, Olin, they got 2 gigs for Caguama that are just so memorable, highlights in my life. Like one for a Day of the Dead show in East LA, this place called Self-Help Graphics. It was just a sea of Chicanos with like skeleton faces, and it was just so like cool. And it was, and Olin gave us a perfect spot. They gave us their spot. That's their neighborhood, so they know these people. But at the time they had an opportunity to go play with the Pogues, so they gave us their, I felt like we won, that day. And then another gig we did with them in San Antonio, and they hooked us up again, and it was during Fiesta in San Antonio, and like we played in this area of town there. It was just the barrio, as you could call it, and it was so cool, dude. I can't just. It was just like, man, why can't every gig be like this? It was just, it made me feel proud. Like, ooh, this, this is the culture part of my experience. I don't get all the time. I'm not gonna get that in Boston or Minneapolis or something. I mean, we'll get cool shows, but nothing like that. And so, playing with like I said, with Federale, with Government Mule, getting to go into, the South, and I think the South gets a bad rap, but to me, I think the South has a lot of soul. In fact, I just read a book called Dixie Lullaby about a guy who's a music writer, and his embarrassments through the years about the South. But, and he was a pretty smart kid. He didn't understand why, his uncles or someone could be racist, and he's, and like look down on blacks, but then seeing like Martin Luther King or some soul artist like Nina Simone that's so super intelligent. He's, he saw this as like, he didn't get it, and he got it really young on his own, and then explaining how during the Allman Brothers, how that changed things for the South a little bit, and got Carter elected or something, and I felt the same way when I went there. I go, man, even though these people could like at the Waffle House or something, with at the long time I had a long braid or whatever, and like to say stuff like tell a Tano and Lone Ranger joke, what I mean, like in good spirit, whatever. But they just I don't know, they don't know the idea of politically correct or something, what I mean. And so I don't know, there I could sort of laugh that off a little bit more than the institutional style of racism, even around here when I see people like put their Black Lives Matter signs in their yard, but then they'll go purposely send their kid to a different school so they don't have to go to Jefferson. What I mean? And it's just like, I don't know, there's just different forms of it, and I love the South. So I got to say, I'm lucky if I had to get a perfect tour to the South, be with Warren Haynes, and, the guy he is there, and he's mentioned in this book and interviewed in this book, and he was such a gentleman. And so a great story with that tour was we were, had one gig in his hometown, which was Asheville. And he asked us, he had a bus and everything, but he was like, do you guys mind if I like tag along with you to Asheville so I can see my folks. And he came and he endorsed us. He came and sat in with us, and we played like Cortez the Killer, and we played Stop Breaking Down, and and I remember my E string breaking, and I looked over at Warren, and I was just like, "Hey, my E string broke," and he goes, "Man, there's never any peace, is there?" Or something. That's what he said in my ear. But anyway, it was cool. The very next day, he told us to meet us at his sister's record store. And it was the day that Tom Waits' new album was coming out, Mule Variations, which is fitting. We were touring with Government Mule, and it was just kind of worked out. And so there we were waiting for Warren, and we bought Mule Variations. Luther bought it. And it was so rad to christen that record in the van with Warren Haynes, and he breaks out a joint, and we just smoke a joint, and, it's like afternoon, and just listen to Mule Variations, and the song Get Behind the Mule became a kind of our theme because we were following Government Mule around, it's like, and so it's just those magic moments like that, like where you just get to I don't know, I wish you could do this full time, but I'm glad it's always been good memories. I've never had like a really bad like tour where it's just I've heard some of these like big rock star, we watch the behind the musics and they just want to kill each other, and it's just like, I don't know. It's usually because of drugs and alcohol, and, and I participate in that, but it's just always been more for me, the love of it. And I feel like, these stories and getting to play the Ryman with Alejandro Escovedo is huge, It's like one day I'm just doing this my regular life with my family, and next thing you know, this summer I got a summer job with Alejandro Escovedo, and we're playing the Ryman, it's beautiful, so. My best friend. I only left this bass behind once when I first met my wife. And it was one of our first dates. She came to see me play, and then I left it in the club. I was like, whoa, I never do that. This must be love. She still reminds me of that all the time. Why can't it be like that still? No. I love you, honey, but this is a special bass. I almost lost this bass in Ireland with Richard Fontaine. And I have since gotten another little cheaper bass to bring on the road now. Because, this one's like not like some fancy bass, but it's my bass. It's the one I got for $150 from Dean Georgie. My favorite one is like, what do you call a bass player without a girlfriend? Is homeless. That's my favorite, and it's some sort of true. I don't know. I've been lucky to juggle my life with my family and the bass, like they're very understanding. I think there's times where I just feel like, some outsiders will, think it's like lame that I get to go travel. But it's like, well, maybe my wife should have started playing bass at 14, This is my ticket to the world, It's like, I don't know. Not everyone gets a ticket like this, So I got to see a flock of cockatoos in Australia, which, up to that point, I'd never seen a cockatoo anywhere but a pet store. And to see like 6 of them in a eucalyptus tree, just happy as hell, like just brought tears in my eyes. I was like, man, those are cockatoos in the wild, or lorikeets or minor birds, like all these birds you see in a pet store, and I don't know. Didn't get to see a kangaroo while I was there, but saw these giant bats that I thought were ravens. I go, why are these ravens out so late? And they're like, those are bats. I'm like, what? It's like this bat flying through, like Dracula through fucking Sydney. And it's like, that's cool stuff.